Shalom, and welcome to another edition of Parasha Talk. I'm Rabbi Elliot Malamet in Highland Park, New Jersey, at the Highland Park Conservative Temple Congregation on Shemet. Joining my good friends, Rabbi Jeremy Kalmanovsky, Anshe Chesed, New York City, Rabbi Barry Chesler, Solomon Schechter Day School of Long Island. We start this Parsha Talk certainly mindful of the suffering, the extraordinary suffering that is being experienced by so many, and we are thinking of our brothers and sisters in Ukraine. Arachaman, hu yivarech otam v'yotziem me'afela la'ora. May God, the merciful one, bless them, keep them, guard them, strengthen them, make sure they are safe, and bring them from darkness to light. We are completing the Book of Shmot this week, Parashat Pekudei. This is an amazing parsha. It's an amazing parsha. I think it's an amazing parsha. You would think that it's not. Maybe people who read the parshiot of the Mishkan seem to think that it's just overwhelming with too much unnecessary information. My daughter she wrote a little sketch. Why are there so many parshiot about Mishkan? Why? But here it starts with Pekudei Mishkan, the accounts of the Mishkan. Can you give me some? Can you frame this in terms of why? Why would the Torah want to give us an accounting? I'm going to turn to you, Barry. Why? What do you think that's about?
Well, thank you for the honor. I think that it's a kind of lavish praise. So one of the things that has occurred to me recently, so we follow in one form or another critical biblical theory. And from time to time, I turn to Richard Elliott Friedman's book, Who Wrote the Bible?
That's the ref. We call him the ref.
It's a wonderful book, and it's especially good for teaching high school students, because he lays everything out in a clear way. And the last time I read it, which wasn't so long ago, what I came away with is this idea that traditionally the four authors, J, E, P, and D, were mostly priests. And we forget that the Torah has a multivalent priestly approach. And, for the priests, this is their work, their life. There's the Mishkan, and later the Beit HaMikdash. And so they love this stuff. So my first year in the pulpit, the president of the synagogue was an architect. And I remember making a comment to him, although I don't remember quite what he responded, about how he might like these parshiot because this was his bread and butter. For most of us, it's not. We could do without, I think, a lot of the details. But it does show what people who love something can do with something to make it lovable.
Right. So it's a remarkable accounting sheet. In the sense, just I'll read, Kol HaZahav, verse 24, Kol HaZahav he'asui lamlacha, all of the gold, Teisha ve'esrim kikar, 29 talents or whatever, Ushva me'ot u'shoshim shekel, and 730 sham. It's not an insufficient amount of gold, and it always raises the question: where did they get this stuff, and how did they get this stuff, and what did they leave with? But maybe I think I like the direction that you are going into, Barry, which is this is a love letter to the Mishkan, I guess, in the way that some people make lists. I don't know, Jeremy, what
Yeah, I think this is quite true, and the priestly writer is very detail oriented. I want to take it in a slightly different direction in that it has to do with being a public trust. I believe last Shabbat, now that I'm on sabbatical, I'm not attending synagogue every Saturday, but I believe last Shabbat was Parshat Shkalim, correct?
Correct.
And I'll take Arba Parshiot for 400.
Yes,
and
please.
And what is Parshat Shkalim? It's there's different kinds of gifts to the temple. Some of them are free will gift, Asher Yidvenu Libo, but some of them are poll taxes. And there's a half shekel for every person, rich, poor, Asher lo yarbev, adal lo yamit. the rich don't give more, the poor don't give less. And so we read that, and it's about an annual poll tax to support the temple. And the Haftarah for that is from 2 Kings chapter 12 about Yehoash who does Bedek Habayit on the temple and repairs some of its when it gets kind of a little run down. And it says that there was a chest in which people put the money, and it was given to the overseers of the work for the repair of the house. ולא יחשבו את האנשים אשר ייתנו את הכסף על ידם, לתת לעושי המלאכה, and there was no calculation done for those whom they gave the money to give over to the workers, כי באמונה הם עושים, because they dealt honestly. And I think that there's something, that passage seems to speak in some respects to this passage, certainly because of the reading on Shabbat Shalom, that there's a claim about the scrupulousness with which the administrators are presumed to manage the public charitable funds. And we know, for example, there's a halacha about nobody should give tzedakah unless you know that the administrators of the fund are absolutely above reproach. And I think this is kind of just a challenge to people who donate to see to it that it's going to go well, people who it's going to go to good purpose, and the people who manage the money have to see to it that it's going to be used with maximal honesty. And so maybe there's something going on here about Moshe, who has undertaken this massive communal project to, maybe to exemplify that he is acting be'emunah, vayaminu b'Adonai Moshe Abdo. Everybody had trust in him, so maybe he has to demonstrate that he's worthy of that trust.
So what you're saying is that this is a kind of proto-transparency. This is transparency.
A little transparency, exactly.
That
sunlight is the best
shekel is accounted for. Every shekel is accounted for. Shekel of gold, shekel of silver, and all the different fabrics and other kinds of materials that went into the Mishkan. Okay, so the first part of this parsha deals with all of that, and I think both approaches here, the love letter to the Mishkan and also the kind of accounting, which is the building of trust. I think those would be valuable angles for many of our readers, listeners, viewers to follow, especially if they want to use this as a Dvar Torah for their own.
I want to add something here because listening to you talk, I am reminded that the Mishkan and later the temple are not humble abodes. Yeah. We have descriptions of humble abodes for God, but this is not it. And I think that what comes through all the details is that this really is a house worthy of the King of Kings. And the King of Kings is not a humble servant, but the master of the universe. And he gets a house that befits that stature.
We're talking about the Mishkan here. It's a tent in the desert. The tent is humble. The things in the tent are made of gold.
I don't know. I think that it's not. I would draw a distinction. It might be humble if it were just a tent, but when you add all the skins and all the jewels, it's not humble.
The jewels.
I'm inclined to agree with Barry about this. I think that people who maybe live in relatively affluent settings can feel discomfort with what might be over the top. People who lived in an ancient world and are depicted here as traveling through the desert, but as the sense that the Mishkan is a template for the Beit HaMikdash, which will follow. Like, I think that they wanted to create something that was just like magnificent and otherworldly, and the medieval cathedrals exemplify the same, that the people who built Chartres Cathedral, they just poured everything they had into the jewel that was their sacred space. So I'm inclined to think like Barry that that this is really, really, really an extraordinary space. We talked about this last week with Bezalel as Michelangelo, or 2 weeks ago.
Sure, no, but
Bezalel as Michelangelo.
so I'm going to take a different approach here, which is that there is a scholar who looks at this and sees some remnants of or comments on Egypt here, and that the dimensions of the Mishkan actually are analogous to the mobile throne tent of Pharaoh, and that there's a deliberate kind of play here that by making this oblong structure, rectangular structure, similar to that the Pharaoh's temporary mobile structure, throne room, the Torah basically is doing this kind of well, it's not satirizing it; it's appropriating it. It's creative appropriation and monotheizing, if you will, the pagan god. So I'm less inclined to think that this was such an elaborate structure, although some of the gold of the menorah, the ark, the table of showbread, those were elaborate structures. We get elaborate when it comes to the temple in Jerusalem. That for sure is an elaborate structure, but this is a structure that can be broken down fairly easily by teams, put together, wrapped up, and carted away.
So I think we have to raise the question of whether this is not a literary device. I think literarily, it's very easy to take the Mishkan apart. You just put in the sentence saying they took the Mishkan apart. But if you imagine the Mishkan, the way it's described, it's not so easy to take this thing apart. Where are you going to put all the skins while you're trying to get the poles to take apart? You know, when you think about our modern sukkah, which is the tarp, that ancient invention, and the plumbing pipe, that's not the Mishkan. That's easy to take apart and move.
Okay.
The Mishkan is more like a house made of Lego that you could take the pieces apart, so to speak, and move them around. It's not so easy to do.
I know that I cannot successfully assemble or disassemble an IKEA piece of furniture without cursing and enormous frustration.
Actually, the curse is part of the directions.
Look, my father, Alav Shalom, was an engineer, and the greatest joy that he had was putting things together. And so let's just say that there are people that are able to do this and people who are not able to do this. And some people can see the world in terms of their constituent parts, and some people are more skilled at reading a text, like we are. Okay, so in this text, I think I want to say that there's a kind of emotional moment here. Vayar Moshe et kol hamlacha. I'm referring to chapter 39, verse 43. At the end of this whole accounting, and the thing is made, okay? Vayar Moshe, he sees all of the work, v'hinei asu ota, and they made it kasher tziva Adonai, like the way that God commanded them. Vayivarech otam Moshe. Moses blessed them. I get a little chill reading that. It's a great moment. It's a great moment where Moses is. You never see Moses really satisfied in the Torah. Moses. It's a tough job leading the Jewish people. And here, he offers them a blessing. Of course, at the end of the Torah, we have Zot HaBracha. Moses leaves the people with a bracha. But can you reflect on this moment, Jeremy? Barry, you want to go jump in? Then Jeremy, go ahead.
Okay, so what's so clear the way that you read this is that this verse is an echo of creation.
Yeah.
Only instead of God, it's Moshe. And before we went on, I suggested that the Mishkan is a symbol of the world.
Yeah.
And here, the world is being created at God's direction, but by human beings. That the way that we become partners of the divine is to do what the divine does, which is to create a world. Only unlike God's world, which is infinite, the Mishkan is finite. And I think the implication here, when it says, Vayar Moshe et kol hamlacha v'hinei asui, Vayar ki tov ma'od, that this was very good.
Yeah.
And he blesses it just like God blesses humanity at the end of the sixth day.
Well, he blesses them. Vayivarech otam. He blesses them. That's the word. Vayivarech otam. And you know, the question. I got this question this week when I was teaching this class, which was, is he blessing them, the constituent elements of the Mishkan, or is he blessing the people who make it? And I offered that, we don't bless inanimate objects. We bless people. And look, Jeremy, how about this kind of? It's a great moment.
It is a totally great moment, and I'm not entirely sure that Moses can't also be blessing the constituent elements because like what does God do at the end of that? God does bless humanity, but it's also Vayivarech at Yom HaShvi'i.
Abstract time. You can't. Time is not a matter.
Well, I don't know. I think that you can sanctify objects. You can sanctify objects. Maybe you can't be beneficent. Like a bracha is an expression of beneficence and well-being. Maybe you can't do that to an object. But in all events, Moshe is definitely blessing the people. Whether blessing the object, also definitely blessing the people. And I think what Barry said is just incredibly vivid and important because God creates the world, but human beings are co-creators of the religious world, of the spiritual world, of the cultural world. And Moshe is affirming that the people are shutafim lakadosh baruch hu b'maaseh breshit. There's a rabbinic phrase, shutaf lakadosh baruch hu, you be God's partner in the work of creation. And that's a thing to aspire to. Like if you, the Gemara says, for example, if you dan din emet lamito, if you judge truly, you are God's partner in creation. And I think that the overall Jewish religion, the religion of Brit, of covenant between God and Israel, is an assumption that at the heart of it is the assumption that we will be partners in co-creating the world. So God gave Moshe a task, and Moshe gave it to the people, and lo and behold, they executed it beautifully. Yeah. And that's why you get the blessing. And we were talking about beforehand the midrashic blessing that Moses says to them. Moses says to the people, Yehi ratzon shetashre shechina b'maaseh yedechem, that may it be God's will that the divine presence will rest on the work of your hands, and that's this has a very vivid liturgical expression.
Sure.
On Havdalah, we recite Psalm 90 at the end of the Saturday night services. We include that line, V'noam Adonai Eloheinu aleinu ma'aseh yadeinu konena aleinu u'ma'aseh yadeinu konenehu. May God establish for us the work of our hands. It's like Havdalah is Kiddush for work, right? Friday night Kiddush is Kiddush for a rest. Havdalah is Kiddush for work. You're going to go out, you're going to do this stuff, you're going to create a better world, and may it be God's will that God's presence will rest on the work of your hands. You will build something that will reflect the divine. I just want to throw in one last thing here, which is the great, I don't know if it's in the play or not, but it's in the movie of that great American Jewish text, The Fiddler on the Roof, that when Mottel gets his sewing machine, the rabbi comes and says, they say, can you bless the sewing machine? He says, and the actor, without translating it, says, I was like, awesome moment. May God's presence work, be manifest in your work.
So I want to pick up on that because I think in Jewish life there's a certain religious genius, and this idea of Yehi ratzon shetashre shechinatcha, that may it be your will that your presence dwell. That becomes the core of the Ushpizin ritual. Ushpizin, if you recall, as our listeners recall, the ceremony of entry into the sukkah, welcoming the guest, the sukkah, and I don't think it's an accident that the composer of the Ushpizin kind of borrowed this theme of Yehi ratzon shetashre shechinatcha. It's may God's will dwell b'maaseh yadeinu, on the work of our hands, but in the Ushpizin ritual, it's Yehi ratzon shetashre shechinatcha beineinu. And the for most of us, I would say, not being terribly creative in our sukkah constructions, it's an oblong rectangle structure, right? As you said, it's easy to make. It's usually fabric and tubing at this point. I suppose not going back too far, but Sukkot were not especially elaborate back in the 16th or 17th century when the Ushpizin ritual was created. People had sheets or some kind of fabric or some kind of beams, and I mean, it's not a big leap to say this is a kind of Mishkan. The sukkah structure is a kind of Mishkan, and that if we are living in the sukkah, it's kind of like we're living in a different kind of place. And instead of saying Shechinatcha b'maaseh yadeinu, that may God's presence dwell in the work of our hands, it's who's in the sukkah. It's all of us that's in the sukkah. So we're saying, may God's presence shetashre shinatcha b'neinu, may it be among us. I find it's such a moment of a kind of spiritual genius that these are layered on top of each other. I don't know if you have a reaction to that or just a nod. We go on.
Beautiful, beautiful. V'shachanti b'tocham.
V'shachanti b'tocham, which is the sukkah. Okay, so I'm gonna make another suggestion that the end of the last chapter 40, is another kind of song to the Mishkan. But first, before we get to the Kasher Tziva Adonai et Moshe, as God commanded Moses, let's talk about the date that the Mishkan is consecrated. And if in speaking about the date, let's construct the narrative arc we'll start with the beginning of Exodus, but maybe we go back to the beginning of Breshit. So the verse is, verse 2 of chapter 40, Biyom HaChodesh HaRishon Bechad LaChodesh, that is the first day of the first month, Takim et Mishkan Oel Moed. You're to raise the Mishkan. So this is going to happen on day 1, month 1 of second year. Okay, Barry, take us. Where's the arc of the narrative arc from the beginning of Exodus?
I think Lark probably somewhere with Noah, but here I think what we want to focus on is that Exodus is a book that has many beginnings. And the first day of the first month is the beginning of chapter 12. It is, in fact, the beginning of the actual Exodus story. Up until then, the Israelites have been enslaved. The plagues have been going on, the first 9 plagues. And with the onset of that first day of Nisan, what comes to be known as Nisan, the story of Israel leaving Egypt begins. And this is the first month, this is the month that's going to establish the calendar. And so when the Mishkan is built on the first day of this first month of the second year, it provides a bracket for that beginning of the story that goes to exactly 1 year before. The Exodus began, and now it's going to end with the construction and the completion of the Mishkan.
That what you just said is exactly Nachmanides writes in the intro. I brought this up earlier in the course of the Sefer. Nachmanides says exactly that the point is that Genesis was about the grandeur of the patriarchs to get up to that incredible level of Avraham, Yitzhak, Yaakov. Then the people are at the bottom of the pit. They're just in terrible, terrible suffering. But they will sort of restore the intimacy and connection with the divine that the ancestors have with the construction of the Mishkan. He's answering the question about if the point of the Sefer Shmot is mostly about, liberation from Egypt and the receipt of the Torah. What's all this? What's Parsha after Parsha about the Mishkan? Well, the Mishkan is what enables them to, in fact, attain that spiritual intimacy with the divine. And what? Okay, the Torah doesn't hammer you over the head with this. As we pointed out when we were talking before we started recording, Jewish tradition has not recorded, has not made a holiday out of Rosh Chodesh Nisan as the day of the Mishkan. We don't, we all know the dates of Passover or Shavuot or something, but not this date. but the Torah does record this, it does report it, so you got to pay at least this much of attention. What a year! Oh my God, what an incredible year! From the bottom of the pit, the most debased slaves. 1 year later, they have constructed this extraordinary sacred space.
So it is a great way to frame this. That is to say, we're reaching the end of this book, and it's a great achievement. But look at all the steps that have gone on in the way. Of course, the plagues, the Exodus, the splitting of the sea, the arrival of Mount Sinai, and then this catastrophe at Mount Sinai, a kind of convulsion at the Golden Calf episode, and a kind of restoration, a second chance that is been given, and now it's represented. The Mishkan now represents the whole story. It represents the testimony. It represents this connection between God and the people, and it's here. And other texts say "Vayhi Mishkan Echad." It's all united. It's all together. It's a kind of it's a great moment where everything seems to have come together, and that's how the parsha ends. Because God now comes together with the people and the Mishkan, with the song of the Mishkan, with its sevenfold refrain of Kasher Tzivah Adonai et Moshe, Kasher Tzivah Adonai et Moshe, that it is built in the way that God had commanded Moses. So we get the final paragraph, and again, I get chills reading it. Vayichas he'anan et oel moed. The cloud covered the tent of meeting, Uchvod Adonai maleh et hamishkan, and the presence or the glory of God filled the Mishkan. V'lo yachol Moshe lavo el moed. He couldn't go inside there. Ki shachan alav anan, because the cloud was on top of it, and Uchvod Adonai maleh et hamishkan. And then the Torah gives us this kind of the closing of this book. When the cloud goes up, the people will go. And if the cloud doesn't go up, the people will not go. Ki anan Adonai la Mishkan yomam. Because the cloud is on the Mishkan by day. Ve'esh tiyeh layla bo. You can hear the music of that verse. And fire will be upon it at night. Le'enei kol beit Yisrael. Before the eyes of all Israel. B'chol ma'asehem. Chazak chazak v'nitchazek. On all their journeys. You can't read that without thinking that this doesn't speak to just the Exodus. It speaks to all time.
Yeah.
So we go back then to the beginning of Sefer Shmot. And at the beginning of Sefer Shmot, the Israel have become very quickly slaves. In just 6 verses, the floor has been swept out from underneath them, and they have been subject to abject misery. And at the end of the book, the Mishkan is filled with God's presence. So we go from a world devoid of God's presence to a world so filled with God's presence, Moses himself cannot even enter.
Yeah.
And it bespeaks, as you suggest, Elliot, a cosmic dimension to the Mishkan. So I want to just make a comment that occurred to me while you were talking about what is the real sin of the golden calf. It occurs to me that the sin is that the original plan was for God's abode to be in heaven. Moses goes up the mountain to get what we call the Torah, but the people need God to be down amongst them. So they fashion the calf. And if we follow the commentators that say that the Mishkan is a response to the episode of the Egel HaZahav, the golden calf, then the Mishkan clearly becomes God's home on earth. Because God cannot abide on Mount Sinai, because that doesn't work for the people. The people need God with them. And hence we have the Mishkan.
Yeah. The Mishkan is a portable sign. They want to take God with them. Yeah. Jeremy. I mean,
I on another, point altogether about this passage and the Kavod Adonai Malei Mishkan, and the divine, the visible divine presence fills up the Mishkan until there's no room for Moses. By the way, the Torah or the Tanakh repeats its stories. The same thing happens when Solomon builds the temple. In 1 Kings chapter 8, and which, we were talking before the show began that, like I myself certainly, and probably lots of our readers know the Chumash a lot better than the rest of the Tanakh. Check out, First Kings chapter 8. It's great chapter. Long Solomon's prayer and the construction of the Mishkan. The same thing happens. And I would say that one of the dynamics about religion is the degree to which God can be so overwhelming that people have no room. Like religion, true religion is a meeting of God and humanity. And sometimes God is just so big that there's no room to meet God. And that is set up here in this passage, like Moshe can't enter, but that's going to change at the beginning of Vayikra. And we can talk about that next week. But God is going to first fill it all, but then have to withdraw a little bit to create that space for the human divine meeting. And I would say that that's where religion happens, this human divine meeting. It's not all about God. It's not all about humanity. It's about the intersection of the two.
So let me just take that. I know we're just about out of time, but we have these moments in the biblical story, all of the biblical Israel, where you have the Mishkan, this great moment, and then you have Solomon 480 years later constructing the temple and having this elaborate convocation, dedication ceremony, where, as you said, the whole place is filled up with God's presence. And then that building gets destroyed. The people are exiled. They come back, and they kind of slap together, whatever they can to rebuild it. Ezra and Nehemiah. It's not clear exactly what happens, and they do this. They do bring sacrifices there. But the moment in the book of Nehemiah where Ezra stands on the water tower and reads the Torah, there's a transition. The Bible itself makes a transition from the holy place to the holy text, and your encounter with the divine is not through ritual of sacrifice and entering holy space as much as it is encountering text. And the blessing is not the blessing that God will give you, but it's the blessing that you offer to God by reading the scripture. And I think that story is in the entire Bible. There's a movement to that. And of course, when Israel gets dispersed after the destruction of the second temple, Herod's temple, we have the text. We build our own shuls, our own, Beit Knesset, elaborate ones, modest ones, modern ones, or just kind of, boxes. And we try to encounter whatever we can through the text. So in some way, the temple gets replaced by our interaction with the text. I don't know if you want to react to that.
I'm reminded when I was a clinical student in Israel, I had for Bible Professor Baruch Schwartz, who has taught at Hebrew University for a number of years. I remember him telling us that there's no point in memorizing the Tanakh because it's such a small book, you could fit it in your pocket and carry it anywhere. If you're going to memorize something, memorize the Talmud because you can't lug that around with you. In a similar way, though, the text that we have that's become our Torah, and in fact, along the lines that you suggested, our Mishkan is a lot easier to carry around than the physical Mishkan.
Yeah.
And the genius of the rabbinic tradition is that we were able to make those connections with God that our ancestors made in the Mishkan through the text.
Through the text.
And we can take that text everywhere. And we have.
So here we are at the end of.
It's amazing that you say this, by the way, Barry, on a day when, as everything's going on in Ukraine, and I'm just struck as I read the names of the places where these battles are, that it's the heartland of Galician and Volhynian, Jewry, like a lot of the famous Hasidic masters that you've heard of. This is where they lived, and the story of the Jewish people in Eastern Europe, which is not totally over, but certainly has been nearly wiped out in the last 100 years. Well, you know what? Actually, wiped out the physical places and didn't wipe out, and many of the people, of course, but we for the most part don't live in those places anymore. But the traveling sanctity of the Mikdash Ma'at, of the small sanctuary, that is the divine presence, or that is synagogues, or that is the books that we read in the synagogues. That's still quite alive, quite alive. That's how we're doing this.
It's fascinating that the last word, or the last two, Bechol Masehem, the journeys of Israel in the desert, but the journeys of the Jewish people throughout the world, and places that no longer have major Jewish population, but still have the echoes, the remnants of Jewish populations, and those are the places that the Mishkan, in quotes, has been throughout the world, all over the world. Well, we have now completed 2 books of the Torah, and we are so thankful to all of the viewers and listeners who have joined us on this journey, this year's journey. We're almost at 2 years of doing the Parsha Talk online, and we want to thank you for being with us. So have everyone, Tada Rabah and Shabbat Shalom, and see you next week on another edition
Shabbat
of
Shalom.
Parsha Talk.